Hey, this is Corey Glenn, and I'm going to do an updated video on how to make your first surgical guide in Blue Sky Plan, but this is going to be in the most recent version, which is 4.13.31. The reason I'm changing this, I've done a previous video, but there's been a whole lot of new features added to Blue Sky, and just thought, I'd show some of those features. And hopefully, if you've never used Blue Sky Plan to make a surgical guide, this ought to get you on your way with just a routine, simple case. So let's go ahead and just open Blue Sky Plan up, and since we're going to be doing a surgical guide, we're going to click on Implant Planning and Surgical Guides. Now, just so you know, in this video, I'm going to do the case in both the wizard mode, which is the simplest for a newcomer to learn, and then right after that, I'll do it in advanced mode, because advanced mode is going to give you some more options to do slightly more complex things. So we'll do the same case in both the wizard mode and in advanced mode. So if you want to use the wizard mode, then that's going to be clicking here on 1 or 2 implant case. Okay, so this is just for simple, straightforward cases, your onesie twosie implants that you don't have to do anything out of the ordinary like an immediate or something like that. It's just a routine edentulous site. So let's click that. And you're going to tell the software what kind of STL model are you going to bring in. So anytime you do a guided surgery, you got to have 2 pieces of data. You got to have the cone beam data, and then you've also got to have an STL model of that arch. Now that could come from an intraoral scan or a desktop scanner, and if that's what you're using, which is 95% of the cases, you'll just leave this on model STL. But just so you know, you can get the STL from taking a CT scan of a stone model or a CT scan of an impression. Okay, so we're going to leave it on model STL, and then you're going to tell it what surgical kit you're using. So there's a lot of kits in here. Most of the bigger name implants are in there. It's going to default to Blue Sky Bio's surgical kit, which I'm a big fan of, and so we're going to leave it on the Blue Sky Keyless Fully Guided Surgery Kit. So let's click OK. And now you're going to need to navigate to wherever you have their cone beam data stored. Alright, so on my computer, I'm going to use this Case1 DICOM, and I'll actually put a Google Drive link to this very case and the STL, so that if you want to download those and practice along with me as you watch this video, you're more than welcome to do that. So we're going to click on the root folder here and just click OK. Alright, so when this window pops up, you've got the opportunity to limit the field of view. Okay, so this is a really large field of view CT. You can see this is the spine, the base of the skull, the socket. We're going to actually limit this down. This is a number 19 first molar site. There's really nothing going on up in the skull that changes my treatment plan. And the bigger the field of view that you deal with, the more computing power your computer is going to need to have. So if you're a bit limited on your RAM and your video card, don't overcomplicate this and give it just tons and tons of data to crunch. Limit it down to the jaw that you're working on, and then click OK. So this is a new feature in this new updated version. It's going to automatically detect the nerves. Alright, so I didn't have to do anything. You can see the nerves have already been mapped here. That used to be a step that you would have to actually do several clicks to accomplish. So I always trust this, but I always want to verify it. Okay, so we're working over here on the patient's left side, so I actually want to scroll over here and just look through that nerve and verify that it looks like it's tracking. Alright, so right there you can see it coming into the mental foramen, and we're going backwards. It looks like it's tracking perfectly. Now periodically as you do this, and I'm going to maximize this window, any of these windows, this upper right corner button you can click, but I wanted to point out on this that you can grab any of these little white nodes and reposition them. So if it were to get off in an area, which doesn't really happen much, but sometimes patients don't have a very distinct canal and it might track off a little bit. If you feel like it's off and you want to move that around, then just when you come across one of those white nodes, grab it, reposition it to where you think the nerve is, and then you can continue on. But this looks great. I don't see any problems whatsoever. We're well past our edentulous site, and so didn't have to really do anything in the step except for just verify. Now you're going to see over here that there's a progress wheel that just shows us the steps that we have to go through, and again, a lot of these are automated now, but it's going to show you how close you are to finishing the case. So all I got to do now is click next. Nerve looks good. And now I need to bring in the STL model. So the one I'm looking for is case 1 gingiva. Again, I'm going to post this as a file attached in the comments so that you can use this, but just whatever the STL model is for this patient, click on that, click open, and all that I have to do in this step is tell it, is this a mandible or is this a maxilla? This one's a mandible, so I'll just select that, click OK, and Blue Sky is going to auto stitch this to the DICOM data. Now this is a very useful feature because I've taught courses on this forever, and it would usually be a third of a course just teaching people how to manually stitch models, how to align them, verify that they're accurate. Being able to do this is very, very helpful. So as in all of these steps, I trust these automatic functions, but I'll always go and check them, okay? Because this is a critical step. If your alignment is off and you proceed, that's going to really screw up the case and guarantee a bad result. So how do we check the alignment? Obviously it looks like it's pretty well aligned up here in the 3D window, but that's really not the most accurate view to check this in. What we want to do is come down here and look at this axial slice, so the one in the blue outline. Again, I'm going to maximize this so I can see better. And I want to scroll up and down, especially through the cusp tips. That's where we need to look. And hopefully you can see that that yellow outline seems like it perfectly corresponds to the outline of the teeth on the CT scan. And that's exactly what we're looking for. If you see that, that tells us it's a great scan, or stitch I should say. And then the other thing I want to do is go over here to the cross-sectional view, and we're going to scroll through this. So I can either use the scroll ball on the mouse and scroll through it, or I can grab this blue slider. And that looks like a great stitch, so I feel confident in moving forward with it. Now, while we're on the screen, let me go over real quick just the basic mouse functionality, because I didn't cover that. If you're in one of these 3D windows, hold your left mouse button down and just spin your model. You can see that that's your rotational movements. Now, while you're also in the screen, hold down your right mouse button and push forward and back. That's your zoom. Alternatively, you can use your scroll wheel if you're hovering in this window. And then hold down your right and left mouse button. That's what we call bodily movement. So those are your basic mouse functions for doing anything in Blue Sky Plan. And then if you just go through these 2D windows, right? So this is the 3D window. If you go to the 2D windows, let's maximize that. I've got most of the same functions. If I hold down the left mouse button, it's not going to do much other than center all of the other views on that area. So if you were to look right here, you can see that that changes where the other views are looking at. But then if I'm in this window and I use the scroll ball, again, that's going to scroll through the volume. If you're in cross section, it'll go cross sectionally. If you're in the axial slice, it'll go axially. And then you probably won't have to use this a ton, especially in a routine case, but if you hold down the right mouse button and push forward, again, that gets your zoom. And so you can zoom in, zoom out. So that's basically going to be the same functions in all of these windows. Here I'm in the axial. I can either use this slider or I can use the scroll ball. I'm going up and down through the volume. Right and left mouse gives me bodily movement of the image. Right mouse alone gives me zoom of the image. Okay, so if you wanted to kind of zoom in and have your view centered on the area you're working on, you could do that. And then finally, the tangential slice, the one that's in the green outline. This window is unique in that it's wherever you're located at in the cross section, it's going to spin that on its axis. So here you see I'm looking at the side from the buccal, and then here I'm looking at it from a cross-sectional view. Now that's not that useful right now, but once we get an implant in the case, that's going to become very useful. And then of course your panoramic view, this just looks like a 2D pan. Wherever I click on this, it's going to center all of the other views. So if I wanted to center on that edentulous site, there we go. Alright, so that's the stitching and the mouse functionality. Let's go ahead and click next. You can see we're already about halfway done, even with all this talking I'm doing. Now this is a brand new feature for this version. And what this does is, historically you had to choose a tooth from a library and then manually position it. And a lot of people seem to struggle with that if you're not used to doing any kind of CAD design. So you'll really like this feature. All I've got to do is click up here on what tooth is going to be missing. And so this is going to be number 19, the lower left first molar. You can also go ahead right now and choose your implant. Now don't worry if you don't exactly know the implant size to use, because you can change that later on. So I'm going to go down here and click on this, and this is where you would pick your implant. So the BioMax is what I personally use, and being that this is a first molar, but I don't really know how big of an implant I can use yet. Usually my default is a 4.3 by 10. That's an implant that can work in a molar, a premolar, or an anterior depending on the site. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Now you do have an option here. You don't have to do this, but I like to do it. While I'm in this, I'm going to click up here on abutment, and we can either select one of the stock abutments that are available in Blue Sky, or what I like to do is click on custom abutment, and I'll leave this at 3 millimeters in diameter and 20 millimeters tall. Okay, so just punch in 20, and all that does is that's going to give you a really good visual indicator of where a screw access hole would be. Alright, so let's click OK, and again I've got the lower left first molar chosen. Let's click OK again, and you'll see when I get back to this 3D window I've got a tooth beside the crosshair. That's indicating that wherever I click next, it's going to design this this wax up. Alright, so I'm going to click right in the middle of the edentulous site. It does matter where you click. Don't go over here and click on the opposite side, or it's going to try to build a tooth over here. Click in the middle of your edentulous site. So a single left click, and the AI tooth generation is going to take over, and it's going to plan a tooth. So it's looking at the adjacent teeth, it is looking at the mesial distal space, the buccal lingual width, and it's going to try to propose a tooth that is appropriate for that area. Now obviously we haven't brought in an opposing model, and so it's not going to have perfectly dialed in occlusion. But let's look at the tooth that it generated. So right mouse to zoom in, and that looks like a pretty darn good proposal. Alright, now you'll notice if I actually put my mouse on the tooth, I'm not clicking anything, I'm just hovering on it, a widget does pop up here. So if I look at this and I think I'd like to make a little bit of a change, alright, so if I was to really be critical on this, the only thing I think I'd change is it looks like it's sloping down a little bit that way, and I just want to show you the widget functionality. So grab this ring, and I could rotate it slightly, and as I do that you see I've opened up a gap on the distal. Alright, so hover on it again, and you've also got some other little buttons on the widget. I've got an arrow, so I could drag this over. Alright, that will bodily move the tooth, and I'll just close back up that space, and I think that looks like a really good proposal. Alright, now you might also see that there are these little nodes out beyond the arrows. What are those? Those are scaling tools. So let's say if I wanted to scale the width of this tooth up a little bit or down a little bit, I can grab the node and it will stretch that tooth in a particular direction. Alright, and then of course whatever view you're looking from, this is going to be the ring you want to use. You don't want to try to grab these rings because you don't have a lot of control looking from this view, but here, since I can see the whole ring, it's very easy to make little tiny adjustments with this. Alright, so that feature is really, really nice. I think you'll like that a lot. So once you've got a tooth proposal that you think looks good, go ahead and click next. And remember, we chose an implant earlier in the process, and so when you click next, now that tooth is in position, but now you have the ability to tweak the implant position. Alright, so it's just dropping the implant directly under that tooth. Now the upcoming version of Blue Sky Plan is actually going to try to ideally position the implant. So it'll actually do bone segmentation, it'll look at the buccal and lingual bone plates, it will look at your mesial distal space and try to center it. So that's coming in a next version, but as for now, you're going to have to modify this a little bit. So to move your implant around, remember you can zoom in a little bit where you can see well, and I can grab the implant itself. So if I just left click on the implant, I can now move this implant around. So I want to get it right in the middle of this edentulous space, but I also want to try to parallel the adjacent roots. All right, so if I grab the ring, left click and drag, that's going to be rotational movements. All right, so I want to get a trajectory that is similar to these adjacent teeth, and then I want to try to be in the center of that tooth. So notice there's two windows here visible. That's because every movement that I make over here, this is where you want to do your implant positioning. But that gives me the ability to see how does my movement affect my screw hole emergence. All right, so right there, obviously I'm in bone, but you don't want to screw axe this hole right there. You'll have bad contours on the crown. So I'm going to get this right here, but then don't just look at it from this one view, right? It looks like we're great from this point of view, but remember, this is the axial slice. If you see this green outline, you're in the axial window. So now I'm looking at it from straight on mesial or distal, and I can evaluate how I want to angle this within the bone. All right, so I generally am trying to come straight into the long axis of that functional cusp on the opposing. So I uprighted it just a little bit, and then let's look at our distance below the bone. So if you're using a conical connection implant, generally you're going to want to be about 1 millimeter subcrestal, and you can make out the crest right there. So I'm going to get about 1 millimeter subcrestal, and then again I'm looking at my screw axis hole. I want to be coming out in the central groove of this tooth, and this is an easy case because we got plenty of bone here, but sometimes you'll have to play with it a little bit more if you've got tighter bone. And then I just want to rotate it around again, look at it from every angle. All right, now I mentioned to you earlier that you do have the ability to change the implant. So suppose I get this positioned and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, man, I've got the bone to go with a bigger implant. If you right click on this implant, you'll see the options down here. You can replace the implant. So let's click on replace. And maybe instead of a 4-3, I think I've got room for a 5-0 implant. So I could change this to a 5x10, which is a huge implant. That's plenty for a molar. And I can change that out. And now you see it's swapped in a 5x10 millimeter implant. Our implant seems to be in a perfect position. We got a good screw access hole, so we're going to click next. So this is another new feature. Historically, you had to draw your guide outline and everything. Now Blue Sky Plan is automatically going to annotate the teeth. It knows where gingival margins are, and it's going to place the surgical guide boundary pretty much at the gingival margin of the teeth. And so again, I didn't do anything here. It's already proposed the guide outline. And if I want to modify this I could grab any one of these nodes, reposition them wherever I want this. All right, so typically it's going to be dead on. You don't have to do any kind of modifications, but if you do want to move it around a little bit, you can. But that looks great. Now there's one step here that it doesn't prompt you to do, and that's because it's not 100% necessary, but that is to create windows in the guide. Okay, so windows are very useful because they give you the ability to see that the teeth are fully seated within that guide, and it's not going to default on to create windows, at least not in this version. That will come in future versions. But if I do want to place windows, just before you click next here to make the guide, right click on your model and you see a button that says add window. Let's click that. Alright, so when I do that, it's going to drop in this little box shape. And this box shape is what's going to get subtracted from the guide, creating you a seating window. Alright, so just like on the tooth widget, you've got the ability to rotate it, to move it in various directions with those arrows, but then you've also got the ability to stretch that window. So I'm going to stretch this thing out. I can make it skinnier, and you can just place as many windows on this guide as you want. Generally, when you're placing a window, you're only looking to expose a cusp tip. Okay, if I was to take this same window and be, let's say down here, that's going to be a problem because now I've got this massive window and my guide ends up being really thin. I'll only have about 1 millimeter of guide thickness, which is going to make that prone to breaking. So let's take this thing and scoot it way up until we're just covering a cusp tip. All right, and that's where you want a window to be. If you want to add a second window, right click again, add another window, and we can do another one. So I don't try to make these things really large. Again, I'm just trying to expose a couple of teeth and just on the cusp tips, and just position those wherever you want to see a seating window. So that looks good to me. All right, so that looks great. We're almost done here, and it's automatically proposed the guide. All I got to do is click next, and now it's going to generate the surgical guide. So now we have our surgical guide. Again, most of this was automated. We had very little inputs other than just checking off on steps and giving the software the green light to go ahead. So this looks like a great guide. You know, I generally want them to come across the midline a little ways, and a minimum, if possible, of 2 teeth to either side. You know, I like to go more if possible, but obviously here that's the most distal tooth. So you are going to get some little windows here created on the proximal teeth, usually by default, because the software knows that your handpiece has to have room to get in here, so it's going to clear out a 15 millimeter perimeter around that. And just by default, that usually means in a single tooth implant, you're going to get a couple of windows on the adjacent teeth there as well. So we've got lots of room here to see that our guide is fully seated before doing any drilling. Everything is looking good here. I like the guide, and so now all I've got to do is click next, and we're essentially done with the case. Now it's just going to do things like save the case, generate a drill report. So where do you want to save your guide file and all that to? I'm going to save it to my downloads, so I'll click OK here. It is saving the project because you've got to have that project saved if you want to open it up and review it before surgery. You'd never want to just create a guide and then X out of the plan without saving it, because let's say if it's 2 weeks ago you designed this, now you have this guide and you can't remember exactly, you know, where you planned it. You know, were you hung over when you planned this and didn't do a great job? Like, you need to be able to look back and verify that this guide correlates to this plan so you know exactly where you're putting it. All right, would you like to complete a case approval form before sending? I generally don't do that. You know, if you wanted to have this approved, you can, but I'm going to click no on this. And you can see here it's going to automatically pop up this window. And so if you are, let's say you are designing your first one, you don't even have a 3D printer yet. Do you want Blue Sky Plan to generate the guide for you and 3D print it and send it to you? It's going to pop up a window here for Lab Pronto, and it'll tell you if you want us to print the guide and stick in the sleeve and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be $49. You could put in the patient info. If you have your own printer and you're going to print this, then just click close on this. We don't have to worry about that. And then it's going to ask you, where would you like to save the drill report? I would suggest you save this in the exact same place that you saved your case file. So I'm going to go to my downloads, click OK. And it's going to generate this PDF, which tells you all the information for this case. It's going to auto-generate several images, all right? And these are very useful because, you know, if you're doing surgery, you don't necessarily want to deglove and scroll through the case when you're trying to remember, you know, how far was I from the nerve or something like that. This just creates some images. You can look at these at a glance. So generally, I'm going to keep this in the patient's electronic chart, but I'll print this out on the day of surgery, and this will get taped up behind the patient on the wall or the 12 o'clock unit. And this just becomes a quick reference that I can look at that, you know, tells me where things are, right? I'm going to have a cross-sectional image. I'm going to have one from the buccal so I can see my distance to the nerve and roots and all that kind of stuff. And then it's also telling you what drill you're going to go to. This is your drill sequence, right? These are your implant part numbers, all that kind of stuff, and then it would have patient's name. I've got this anonymized, so that I can share it with you. So save this, right? And it's already saved, so I'm going to X out of this. And you can see here it's saved that. I'll click OK again. And then finally, when I click next, it's going to add all of those parts to my cart in Blue Sky's website. And so you can see there's the kit. Do I need the kit? No, I could X out of that. Do I need to buy a tube? Maybe I already have that. I can X out of whatever I want. Maybe I just want to buy the implant. You could just get rid of everything but the implant in your cart and then proceed to checkout, and Blue Sky just makes it very easy for you to do all that. Let's say I've got everything. I can just X out of this. And now you've completed the process, so I could close the wizard. And when I do that, I'm going to be back to just the basic Blue Sky plan window here. We're out of the wizard. We've done everything. But let's go and look at the files that we've generated. If I go to my downloads, you can see here is my drill report. Here is my surgical guide, and here is my saved Blue Sky plan file. All right, and that's critical that you keep all of these organized. Have a system of organization. In my office, everything got saved to our server in a folder with the patient's name on it, and that way it was accessible to every operatory in my office. And then I also had that backing up to the cloud, so that if I wanted to work on a case when I get home, I could do that, save it back into the cloud. When I get to the office, it's saved in the server. I could 3D print it if my printer's at the office. But try to keep all your files organized and associated with the same patient, because if you don't and you just save this randomly in your downloads, and then 3 weeks from now you're going to do the case, it might be difficult to find everything. So there's all my files. If you wanted to see the guide, I can click on that. This is just opening that guide in Meshmixer, which is just a generic CAD program for 3D viewing and editing. There's my guide file. Everything looks great with it. And if I wanted to print that, I've got the Sprint Ready software on my computer, so I could launch Rayware, for example. And if I wanted to print this, I could simply come up here, tell it I'm going to use Surgical Guide Resin. All right, so Surgical Guide 3, and then I would simply import that guide file. So click on the Add button. It's in my downloads. Here is that guide. And if you are going to do your own printing, you always want to have this guide positioned with the intaglio facing up, because it's going to have to build some supports onto this to print. It's telling me that this is not printable. There's obviously overhangs, so I need to add supports. In this software, I can do that by clicking Fix. And now I've got a green light, everything's ready. And if I wanted to print this, I would simply go here. It tells me the volume of material to be used, how long it'll take, and if I were connected to my printer, which I'm not right now, I would just click Print. Okay, so it's a very easy process. Designing your first guide should be pretty straightforward in a routine case like this using that wizard mode. All right, so that is doing this case in the wizard. Again, very automated, lots and lots of automated features. So very useful for a newcomer to do straightforward onesie-twosie cases. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go up here to File and click on Close Project. And I'm going to discard the changes because, as I mentioned, I want to show you doing the same case, only now I'm going to do it in advanced mode.